I mix what I like, what I like.
I mix what I like is exactly where you want and need to be. I mix what I like, organic, vegan, soul food from your immediate diet. Live healthy. Live healthy.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the brothers and the folks for having me on the station. And I want to give a shout out to everybody in the D.C. area while I'm here, and encourage all of those who are listening to donate to the station to keep everything going. And if I could help, if y'all listening in because I'm here, then cool. If y'all listening in as the enemy because I'm here, we also take donations from the enemy too. We will take the money and run. So I just want to say that. But in answering your question, brother, I don't think we got that much time on the air to answer. It's a pretty comprehensive question, but I'll try to sum it up by taking off from where you initiated the question. Yes, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. History doesn't repeat itself, but it can rhyme. And it's true that the conditions that existed in the 1960s or even in the 1950s are not have developed. Technology has created the global village where communications is instant. We could witness events in real time, just as we're witnessing the genocide of the Palestinian people by the European settler state of Israel in real time. And I think that this has had an enormous impact and effect on a generation that perhaps naively believed that the United States and the so-called Western democracies were about freedom of speech, were about human rights, were about peaceful protest and dissent, only to find out that it's the complete opposite, that the Western European nations, the United States in particular, are devoid of any ethical or moral character or practice. That we are engaging right now in this historical moment, the unraveling of a mythology, of a I would say a delusional a pedagogy, a delusional history of white supremacy. White supremacy is a delusion, but it's a delusion that has been empowered over 350 years after the papal bull of the Catholic Church that declared that people of color, that people who are natives, that Africans had no soul, and therefore anything that you did to them was acceptable. And it was out of this confluence of religion and ideology and the false notion of white supremacy that Europe adopted the ideal and the notion of white man's burden, the mission to civilize the world. And by civilize the world, they meant conquer the world and take everyone's property and territory and inculcate people, indoctrinate people with the religion and ideology of white supremacy. So where we are at today is we're witnessing in real time the last European settler project of over 300 years, and that's the European settler state of Israel. We have to understand that as these young people are beginning to wake up to that Zionism has its auspices in the expansion of the British Empire after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, that Lebanon and the so-called Levant and Palestine Israel didn't come into existence in these lands until after the first year of my birth. I was born in 1944, and the state of Israel, the European Zionist settled state of Israel, didn't exist. It didn't exist until 1948, and it was created in order to maintain the type of hegemonic Western imperial control in a vital region, Western Asia, of the globe, a vital region to the survival of European economies and imperialism. So what we're looking at today, when we look at the genocide that's going on in front of our very eyes, on TikTok, on Instagram, we're witnessing the last settler state, the last colonized attempt, a project of Europeans to take the land and the territory of another people, of an indigenous people. And I might add, too, for all of those who might be listening, and all of those who are subject to the propaganda that to be anti-Zionist is to be anti-Semitic. We need to understand that Zionism in its ideology, in its conception, and in its practice is anti-Semitic, because the only Semitic people in Palestine are the Palestinians, not the European Ashkenazi Jews. And we need to understand also that Zionism is not a reflection of Judaism. Zionism is not a religious ideology. It's a white supremacist colonizing ideology. And so once we understand this, we won't get mixed up in how we look at this historical moment. When we look at the rise of fascism in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, after World War I, when we look at the rise of fascism, the rise of fascism started out as a supposedly working class movement, a movement to empower the workers. And so we see that the word fascisti comes from the Italian word. The fascists began in Italy. They spread to Eastern Europe and to Germany, and Germany became the foremost purveyor or proponent of modern fascism. And modern fascism of Germany was based on what? It was based on the ideal of the Aryan white supremacist superiority. It was based on white supremacy. And it killed not only 6 million people of the Jewish faith, Ashkenazi Jews, it killed millions of Roma people, millions of other people who were not considered human by the German fascists. So I just want to say that what we're looking at today is the evolution of democratic fascism. Democratic fascism is the fascism of democracies that suppress the rights and self-determination of people of color and the former colonial states. So Israel, the European settler state, is that last project. Well, yes. Well, for those, well, first of all, BAP and iMWiL and you did have a role in me putting the article in the Black Agenda Report. So don't get too modest up in this piece here. But the history of police militarization is not that remote. It began to develop in the 1960s in a response to similar types of demonstrations that we are seeing today on the college campuses around the country, in opposition to the genocide of the Palestinian people. In the 1960s, after the civil rights, the symbolic victory of the Voting Rights Act of 1964, the struggle for black power and black empowerment began to take hold in the urban areas of the United States. Every summer, almost year-round, black colonies that we call the hood today were erupting against the police brutality and racist segregation that was still at large in the black urban areas. And in order to deal with this uprising and this militant turn in the civil rights movement, the United States government launched this counterintelligence program to subvert black movements, black leaders, to neutralize black leadership, and to make sure that black people did not coalesce into an independent political party or independent political entity based on a militant understanding and a militant demand for black human rights and black civil rights. So it became very important for the United States government to set an example to curtail, to set an example of the consequences for black struggle, for militancy, for black radicalism. So when Kwame Ture, who we know as Stokely Carmichael, first shouted "Black Power," I believe it was in the march on Selma, and shout out to SNCC and organizers of SNCC, who first threw up their fist and declared Black Power. The U.S. government was terrified by this very notion of black empowerment, this very idea that black people would organize themselves independent of the Democratic and Republican Party. And at the same time, 2 years later, after the symbolic victory of the Voting Rights Act, the Black Panther Party came into existence in 1966 in Oakland, California. The founders, Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton, advocated armed self-defense, that African people had the right to self-defense against racist attack and against racist police murder and racist police violence. So the Black Panther Party issued a number of declarations demanding that black people arm themselves, or otherwise they will harm themselves, and that we had a right to self-defense. So Black Panther Party officers sprung up across the country as black activists, joined the call for black self-defense, began to organize in the community for community control of the police, began to organize in the community for decentralization of the police. This sent shockwaves through the establishment, and so in 1969, early 1969, the police launched an attack on the Los Angeles Police Department, on the Los Angeles chapter of the Black Panther Party. And they launched this attack with a militarized unit that they call SWAT. And this was the first time that the term SWAT came into the public lexicon. They launched this attack with militarized vehicles, with police officers in armored vests and with helmets and military assault rifles. They launched this attack on the Black Panther Party office, and the idea was to send a message to black people that you could not resist the legal violence of the state. That anybody that talked about self-defense in their community, they would be met with unmitigated violence and repression. But the problem is that the Black Panther office was fortified. It was fortified, and police didn't know it was fortified. So when they attacked the Black Panther office early on the morning in 1969, they found themselves repulsed, and they found themselves having to forge or establish a siege of the Black Panther office, which allowed the community to come out and witness what was happening, or what allowed the TV cameras to come out and witness what was going on. And the Panthers in the office then surrendered, and they came out alive. This sent a signal that we could defend ourselves against the armed agents of the state. And I'd like to add too that just 4 days before, Fred Hampton was assassinated by a similar attack in Chicago by the Chicago Police Department. He was assassinated and murdered in his sleep, and he was drugged by an undercover agent of the FBI who gave the necessary information to access the Panther location to the Chicago Police Department, and they murdered Fred Hampton in his sleep. But that didn't happen with the Panthers in LA. And so it was at this time that we first heard the word SWAT, Special Weapons and Tactics. And from then on, as the anti-Vietnam War protests grew, as black radicalism became more assertive. The right to self-defense became more vocal. Black students took over Jackson State University armed and demanded a change in the curriculum at that university. As these protests arose and the idea of black self-defense and community control began to take hold, the United States government began its special operations to militarize the police. They've passed the Omnibus Crime and Control Bill that allowed the police to be trained on a military basis. It was called the War on Crime. And then also Nixon, when he came into office, in order to divide the peace movement from the black liberation movement, from the militant black struggles, he devised or created the war on drugs. And then we had LBJ, before he left office, declaring the war on poverty. And so all of these wars were designed to encapsulate black ideas of political autonomy and self-defense. And we have today what we have, the Congressional Black Caucus, which are a bunch of bootlickers and elected officials who grew out of the war on poverty from the poverty pimps of the late 60s and early 70s. And we have the mayors of black faces in high places, police chiefs that have come out of the counter to our community control of our institutions and public safety. Well, I like to say that one of the major objectives of the United States government was to make sure that the African diaspora never unified with Africans on the continent around the idea and the notion of pan-African liberation. That this had to be dispelled, and so they came up with a whole bunch of economic black capitalist programs like Trans-African Economic Help, and they used the word Trans-African because to use the word Pan-African would mean they would have to rewrite the history of the Pan-African movement, which evolved and developed in the diaspora. It began with Marcus Mosiah Garvey and the Pan-African movement of the early 20th century, and it evolved in all the way up to the liberation and the emancipation of Ghana. I believe it was 1957. Yeah, under Kwame Nkrumah, Assegiefo Kwame Nkrumah, who was a Pan-African and who stated at the beginning of the nation state of Ghana that the independence of Ghana was meaningless without the total independence and unity of Africa and from colonialism and ideas of capitalist imperialism and white supremacy. So there's always been a concerted effort by the United States government, by the European unions, by European former colonizers to maintain a rift between the African diaspora and the black the Pan-African movements on the continent. And so just as Olombe Brath, who was my mentor in Pan-Africanism, taught me, he said that we are beset, and when he said we were talking about the Africans in the diaspora, he said we are beset by a post-traumatic syndrome called the residual absentee slave mentality, and that we think of ourselves as victims, and we struggle within the paradigm of white supremacy as victims. We begin to look at ourselves as victims rather than look at our history of resistance, our radical traditions of resistance, and the victories that we have won ever since the bullwhip days. And he says on the African continent there's a similar syndrome, and it's called the residual absentee colonial mentality. And this is the mentality of the neo-colonialists. This is the mentality of the bootlickers who are presently part and parcel of the political elite in many of the African countries. This is why we have the African Union, which came out of the original OAU. this is why we have an African Union that sat idly by while Gaddafi was deposed and murdered by NATO and the U.S. and the United States. And this is why we have the most volatile and significant humanitarian crisis going on right now outside of Palestine and Sudan. And this is why we don't understand the struggle in Sudan. We don't put the struggle in Sudan in the forefront because we don't know of our relationship to Africa and how our tax dollars to maintain the U.S. military goes into maintaining AFRICOM and the U.S. presence in Africa. And that's designed to protect and defend the Western access to the resources of the African continent. So it was always a design to maintain that the Pan-African unity that emanated from the diaspora would never take effect on the African continent. And that's changing today. The Americans are being kicked out of Niger.
That's right.
The French are being run out of Mali, run out of Burkina Faso, and Chad, and the U.S. is desperately financing the UAE militarily to try to undermine the transition to democracy in the Sudan. So we need to understand now Pan-Africanism is more crucial and is more vital than ever before. Pan-Africanism is a solidarity with all oppressed people who are opposed to colonialism and the neurotic notion of white supremacy and U.S. imperialism. So I just wanted to say that.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.